Yes, yes, yes. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. All right. And if you can see and hear me clearly, please, please, please do me a favor and press some hearts or comment into the chat box. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Prophet Jonathan. Good morning, Pastor Ben. Good morning to those of you who are watching me on YouTube. Good morning to those of you who are watching through your laptops. Good morning to those of you who are popping in and going to catch the replay. Thank you to my replay viewers as well. I want to say happy Wednesday. This is WINSDAY Wednesday for us. And hopefully you're going to hear something today that will help you win in your life, in your love relationships. And those of you who desire to be married, hopefully you will hear something today that will help you so that you don't make some of the mistakes that many people make in that process and in that pursuit. All right. Next Wednesday, I've actually gotten some people who want me to do some readings from my novel series. So next Wednesday, I will pick a passage from each one of my novels, something I felt that is key in each one of those books, and I will read you a short passage from my novels, and then we'll go back into teaching. One of the things that people use my novel series for is for premarital counseling. I've had a couple of pastors that have ordered sets, and they have basically said, thank you very much for saying all the things that we want to say. But we know that coming from us, sometimes people can get offended. So what I have done is I've taken dating and courtship principles and I have put them in a very entertaining storyline to help people actually get the principles, but also learn and be entertained at the same time. So that was one of the purposes of the novel series, is to really help people understand that yes, we have there are real people going through real issues, but God has answers. And so one of the things they do is if they get a couple that is coming to them that wants to get married, they actually give them my book series and say, read this. All right, which I think is fascinating. But they said it really does help people decide whether or not they are supposed to be with each other, which I think is very powerful. So I just put that out there for pastors and leaders. If you're doing marriage counseling and you are maybe working with a couple that is maybe difficult to work with, or they're still kind of in the undecisive state, my novels have really helped people to define and solidify whether or not they're actually supposed to be in a relationship with each other. I've had some people that have read the novels with their intended, and I've only had one person call off their engagement. But most people who I've read have said, yes, we know we're supposed to be together. They've actually gotten married. Now they have children. One couple actually, in honor of myself, got married on my birthday. And so that has been just a whole different journey for me, just in obeying God and taking the time to write what he was telling me to write. I do have, again, one more novel in the series that hopefully, Lord willing, will be out this year. All right, so let's get into our books for today. Kingdom Marriage by Tony Evans. All right, we're going to pick up with this, talking about thorns. But we're going to start today with Labor of Love. All right, which we started the introduction last week. So I'm going to give you a moment to share this broadcast out before we jump into the reading. And I'm going to take a moment to share as well. All right, with my fellow Periscope groups. And I'm going to take one moment to share it to my Facebook. So let's get started. Remember, we are now learning about the history of dating. That is this book here, Labor of Love by Mara Weigel. Chapter 1, Tricks. A free lunch is getting harder to come by in business or pleasure. When I ask people how they would define a date and what a date is, they usually say that it involves a person inviting another person out to eat or drink something or to consume something or some other kind of entertainment. Then they note wistfully how rare this has become. Articles that lament the death of dating frequently cite the absence of such excursions as evidence of the decline of romance. Yet at the dawn of dating, the idea of a man taking a woman somewhere and paying for something for her was shocking. Previously, looking for love had not involved going out in public or spending money. Gentlemen, let that sink in. Do I need to say that one more time? I think I do. Previously, okay, looking for love had not involved going out in public or spending money. So around 1900s, when the police started to notice that young people were meeting up on city streets and going out together, they became concerned. Many early daters, the female ones anyway, were arrested for it. Can you imagine that today? Arresting somebody for dating? Being out in public with a male who was not your family member? In the eyes of the authorities, women who let men buy them food and drinks or gifts and entrance tickets looked like whores. Oh me, oh my. And making a date seem like the same as turning a trick. Wow. How far we have come, right? The word date, all right? Let me see. I think I need my board for today. Make sure I got my board out. All right. The word date first appeared in print in the sense that we now use it. This is how long ago. In the sense that we now use it, the word date first appeared in print in 1896. A writer named George Ade dropped it in a weekly column that he wrote for the Chicago Record. The column was called Stories of the Streets and Towns. It promised to give his middle-class readers a glimpse into how the working classes lived. All right? How the working classes lived. The protagonist of the column is a young clerk named Artie. When Artie suspects that his girlfriend has been seeing other people and is losing interest in him, he confronts her. I suppose the other boys are filling all my dates. So the term date had to do, right, with the times you spent, the actual physical time that you spent with another person. In an installment published 3 years later, he gawks at another girl's popularity. Her date book had to be kept on the double entry system. The girls a boy like Artie would have dated were a brand new type. In Chicago, people call them this. Let me put the term back here. My. So, Chicago gets to be famous again for coming up with the invention of the word date. In the context we use it now. This is what they were called in Chicago. These women who were out on the streets with men, taking food and money from them for company, were called women adrift. Just let that sink in. I need this to sink all the way in. All right? This is why it's important for us to understand an origin of a thing, because if you plan on dating, the spirit of the thing is that you are considered a woman adrift. Not a woman with purpose, okay? There's plenty of women with purpose. There's plenty of women with vision. But it was understood in that day that you were a woman adrift. Okay? Somebody can hashtag that. Starting in the 1880s, more and more women who had grown up on farms or in small towns began leaving their homes to go look for work in cities. When they arrived, they crashed with distant relatives or found cheap rooms in boarding houses. And there's actually a series on this, an English series on this, that concept called The Paradise, that I just finished recently, where a new department store was opening, and the women actually worked at the department store pretty much for food and board, and they actually lived in the department store because they didn't have a place to stay. So that was where they lived, they worked, and everything inside of this department store. So they either bunked with a distant relative, or they found a cheap room in a boarding house. Changes in the economy were creating more and more opportunities for them. They could make garments and other light goods in factories. They could become sales girls in department stores or day servants in the homes of rich families. They could learn shorthand and become office secretaries. Or they could work in the laundries, restaurants, and cabarets. African American women were even more likely than white women to be looking for work outside their homes. After the Civil War, a huge population of former slaves tried to find jobs. Discrimination kept many black men from earning living wages. So, you got a nuclear home of, you have a nuclear home of male and female, all right? And because of discrimination in the threat of, quote unquote, the dangerous black man, discrimination kept black men from earning living wages. And so black women in cities often ended up stuck in the positions that nobody else wanted. Somebody had to work. So she had to go outside of the home, right? Because somebody had to work. All right? Didn't mean that she was being bossy. It just meant somebody had to work. So whichever one of us who could actually get employment went and got employment. So black women end up in positions that nobody else wanted, usually probably housekeeper, all right, working in some sort of domestic capacity in the cities. In 1900, 44% of them worked in domestic service. Most were desperate to leave it. While in a white household, they remained vulnerable to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Many tried to transition to day work. Others even opted for heavy labor. In the 1890s, the stock market crash set off the worst economic crisis that the United States had ever experienced. This actually sped up the flood of single women into cities. At the same time, a huge wave of immigrants arriving from Italy and Eastern Europe, as we learned yesterday, crammed into tenements alongside the Irish who already lived there. The female members of these families also joined the job hunt. So this was a time when economy was not doing well, when you had an influx of new people coming into the market. Then you had oppressed people who had been freed, were still looking for employment because they were leaving the South, coming to the North. So you have the Great Migration going on at the same time. All right. And then you also had the stock market crash. So it was basically a recipe for a disaster. In the 1960s, the second wave feminist movement canonized the appeal that Betty Friedan made in The Feminine Mystique, very famous book for second wave feminism. All right. Friedan told housewives, okay, so think housewives, white women, because that was not the story for black women. All right, that's a whole other broadcast. Black women were leaving their homes because their black men could not get jobs. Got it? White women were convinced by Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. She told housewives to flee the suburbs and take on paid work. Did y'all hear that? I hope you heard that. So this was about discontent. White women being discontent in their place, in their homes, with their structure. All right? So she says in her book, she convinces them, these housewives, to flee the suburbs and take on paid work. Not that they were forced to. Not that they had to. It was a different dynamic. All right? So this is why a lot of people say that historically, black feminism and white feminism are actually two different things. All right? Just want to make that clear. So today it is easy to forget that by 1900, nearly half of American women were already working. Excuse me 1 second. All right. It's easy to forget. All right. So, at work or on the way to and from work, they were crossing paths with men. It is hardly surprising that some of these singles were interested in flirting and pursuing relationships with one another. And it made sense for them to do so in public places because where else did they have? All right? Where else did they have? They were leaving their homes. They were going into the cities. So that became, the public place became the meeting ground for dating. The son of a rabbi, Samuel Chotsanov, came with his family from Vitebsk, Russia, to New York when he was 17 years old. They lived in a housing project on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Chotsanov grew up to be a well-known music critic, and in his memoirs, he described their home in the Stanton Street settlement. The average apartment consisted of 3 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, and a doorless and windowless bedroom between. The etiquette of courting was strict, he added. If a young man came to call on his older sister, the two of them would have to crowd in the kitchen. If his parents were out, they made Samuel stay in to spy on his sister and any suitors who turned up. So, courting required company. Somebody can put that on the screen. Courting required company. Privacy in the home was practically unknown, he recalled. Privacy could only be had in public. Of course, traditional parents would have preferred to set up their children through family members or matchmakers. Because before all of this dating, that's how you were set up. So courting required company. It required someone to accompany you. And people are saying, well, that's old-fashioned. Before courting, either your family members or a matchmaker set you up. All right? So matchmaking is not something that is new. It's actually something that's making a return, except it's just digital matchmaking, but it is matchmaking. All right? Those sites that people go on, that's a form of matchmaking. It's just digital. but courting required company. Why? Because they were trying to guard your reputation. So traditional parents would have preferred to set up their children through family members or matchmakers. In the old country, your family and community had controlled courtships. Many ethnic and religious groups funded political and theatrical clubs in the hopes that their children would meet there. But even strict parents tended to trust their children not to do anything too untoward outside. Many courting couples were allowed to go walking and attend concerts, balls, and plays together. When young Samuel headed out to the park near his home, he saw young men and women everywhere. They strolled hand in hand and squeezed next to each other on benches. They tucked themselves between trees and tried to steal kisses and caresses. English, Russian, and Yiddish drifted through the air. The girls mostly worked in laundries and textile factories. The men worked in industrial sweatshops. As soon as they punched out, they met up. As twilight wore on, the street lights came on, and the streets became like one large party into the darkening corners of which couples slipped. Someone might see you, but nobody was likely to. The risk you took became part of your bond. It was a secret that you shared. For people who could afford it, there were a growing number of other date spots in cities across the country. Saloons, restaurants, dance halls, and amusement parks started springing up to cater to new arrivals. The more daters went out, the more destinations they began to have to choose from. There were penny arcades packed with games. As films grew in length and quality, the owners of such establishments added projectors and started charging 5 cents admission. By 1908, there were 10,000 Nickelodeons across America. So Nickelodeons was actually the 5-cent movies that people could go and see. So as you can see, that as the demand for dating grows, the demand for public places of entertainment and amusement also grows, because now they're trying to house, or they're trying to find places for these people to have these meetups. All right. So you can look at it this way, that dating, right, becomes big business. Hello, movie theaters. Hello, Chuck E. Cheese. What's some other ones? Hello, Walt Disney. Okay. These establishments of amusement entertainment began to make their money off of people going out and dating. So if dating stops in the traditional sense, a lot of these places are going to lose what? Somebody will figure it out. All right. So it behooves big business, right, to keep dating going, because dating fueled an economy. It fueled an economy. It fueled new businesses. Earning money gave young women a new degree of freedom to decide where they would go with whom. Still, their wages did not amount to much. As we see today, there's still a pay gap and a wage gap with men and women. Despite the record numbers of women entering the workforce, the belief remained widespread they were working not to support themselves, but only to supplement the earnings of fathers or husbands. So when people keep asking, why do we not have the wage gap? I mean, why do we have the wage gap that we have? A part of it is this notion, okay, that women are either being taken care of by a family, or they're being taken care of by a husband, so they don't need to make as much as their counterpart. And people may not say that aloud, because, you know, they could probably get charged with something. All right. But the idea is you have either a family or you have a male figure in your life that can take care of you, so you don't need as much money as the men do. Let me say that again, because I don't think people understand why there is a wealth gap. Again, it was a widespread belief that they were working, that women were working not to just support themselves singly, but only to supplement the earnings of fathers or husbands. Employers use this misconception as an excuse to pay women far less than they paid men. And they still use that as an excuse today, believe it or not. In 1900, the average female worker earned less than half of what a man would earn in the same position. This meant that women adrift hardly made enough to eat, much less to spend on leisure. If I had to buy all my meals, I'd never get along, a young woman living in a boarding house in Hell's Kitchen told a social worker in 1915. The social worker, Esther Packard, was preparing a series of reports on the lives of women and children in the neighborhood. If my boyfriend did not take me out, another woman asked, how could I ever go out? Packard saw her point. In her case file, she noted, the acceptance on the part of the girl of almost any invitation needs little explanation when one realizes that she often goes pleasureless unless she accepts free treats. So let's kind of put some things together here. You have, so dating. You have the man and you have the woman. And remember, they said she was earning less than half. Now I think it's up to 66 cents or something like that for every dollar a man makes. So back then, for every dollar he made, she might have been making 50 cents or 45 cents. All right? So unequal pay, all right? Unequal pay leads to her saying, yes, I'll go out with him for free treats. So unequal pay actually helps men and helps facilitate men, all right, in their quest for picking up a young lady. And then because of this bond that they want to create, it now creates the industry, right? It now creates the movies and the game places, your pool halls, your bowling alleys, right? It now creates the industry that helps facilitate a place for these two to meet. But it goes back to, she's saying, I can't even make enough to earn a living, so I'm going to take the free treats. And because she's willing to take the free treats, he now has an opportunity to ask her, because she is in a vulnerable economic state, to accept the free treats. So when the revolution starts happening with women, and women are demanding equal pay, there are a lot of reasons why men are going to buck against that. Right? This is where you get the songs, I'm every woman, it's all in me. I'm an independent woman. I got my own house. I have my own car. I have my own this. I have my own that. Right? It takes away the man's ability to be needed. Got it? Most middle-class onlookers were less sympathetic. They had their own system of courtship. It was called calling, or calling on a person. And around 1900, it still followed an elaborate set of rules, which actually the middle class got this from the upper class, where they would actually do this thing here called calling, where they might meet in a formal setting. The gentleman might get the approval of the parents for permission to call upon the girl that he was interested in, and then the next day or the next day or so, he would call at her house, And again, there would be a chaperone there. There would be company there, excuse me, while they had their conversation. When a girl reached a certain age, usually around 16, she became eligible to receive suitors. So when people ask, where do we get these ages of consent from? It dates back to these times, right? The age of consent for relationship or sex in many states is 16. Some states is 17. It really probably should be 18. All right. But she reached the age of eligibility for a relationship, which was usually around 16. She became eligible to receive suitors. For the first year, all right, her mother would invite men to call on her on one of several afternoons per week that they both spent time at home. So again, she was never alone in the house with a caller. After that, if she met a man she liked at one of the social gatherings she attended, she could ask him over to the house herself. A man might simply show up at the home of a young lady he admired. In this case, however, decorum required him to present his card to the servant who opened the door. So, they would have these little calling cards that actually had the name of whoever it was on the card, and they would present that to the housekeeper. The housekeeper would put the card on a tray and would actually take it to the parent and the young lady. They would read the card, and then they would decide whether or not she was at home or she was available to be seen. All right. Until the beginning of the First World War, it was common for even households with average incomes to employ one servant. She would ask him to wait while she saw whether the young lady was in or not. So it was a very structured kind of system that if she didn't want to see you, she didn't have to see you. All right. You might have wanted her attention, but she didn't have to give it to you. Now, it would be nice if something like that was included in Facebook, so we wouldn't be getting all of these DMs from people saying crazy stuff, right? Nowadays, you have guys who don't have any decorum who just jump right into your direct message, right? They jump right into your Facebook inbox, or they inbox you on your private message on IG. And some of them, they don't even start with a hello, unfortunately. In some cases, they send you pictures of their body parts, like they're selling something. So there was an elaborate kind of process that a man went through if he was actually interested in a young lady, which lets us know that if he was going through a process, chances are he was taking his time and he had to be really serious and sure that he wanted to pursue her. He didn't have 10, 20 women that he was going to see to do this with, because it would have gotten out into the community that he was seeing several women. All right. If the girl did not want to see her visitor, she could tell her servant to say she was not there. If she did, he could come into her parlor. There, the pair could talk or sing and play the piano, chaperoned by her mother and maybe other relatives and friends as well. So there was no secret conversations happening. There was no ability at this point for him to persuade her with his words, because they had company. All right. So it deterred him from trying to present himself or trying to seduce her into a relationship. Today, we look and we see girls have been completely duped. Some of them have been completely brainwashed. And we're like, man, what happened? As the slang for it is, he ran some very good game. He ran a good game on her, right? And so now she's in this relationship. She's captured by his word. She's captured by his promises. And he's not really producing anything. And her friends are looking like, I don't understand why you're still in a relationship with him. Well, it's because of his words and other things that may have happened in the relationship without company. Today, calling sounds like holding an awkward kind of office hour, but to the people who did it, it offered comforts of clear conventions and a community to watch over you while you perform them. It also reinforced a set of strong beliefs about the proper places of men and women. The ritual made men into agents of pursuit. It made women the objects of desire. Now, with the way our society has progressed, all right, a man puts out an accidental picture of his body parts and the internet goes crazy. And women are now pursuing that man because he has now become the object of desire, and they have now become the agents of pursuit. And we don't understand how backwards this is. Some called it the doctrine of separate spheres. The doctrine of separate spheres. It held that women should stay in their homes tending to their families. Men, by contrast, should compete with one another to earn money in public. Political conservatives now call these gender roles traditional and claim that they have been hardwired into us by evolution. But there is nothing timeless about them. In fact, the idea that men and women were so fundamentally different would have made little sense to people who lived even a few hundred years ago. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people in Europe and the United States subsisted by running small farms or businesses with members of their extended families. The men and women assumed different responsibilities. He plowed the fields, she killed the chickens. She churned the butter, he took it to town to sell. But both were clearly engaged in the same endeavor. So were their children. It's no accident that in English we call childbirth labor. After the physical burden of pregnancy and giving birth, there is all the work that follows. Feeding and caring for your offspring, teaching them enough to get by and get along with others. You had children because you expected them to help you at work and to care for you during your old age. In this way, the goals of labor and the goals of love dovetailed or came together. When masses of people began to leave farms for factories and family businesses for large corporations, the work that women did in raising children and caring for their husbands continued to create economic value. Women sustained and replenished the workforce, and they drove the consumption. As industrialization progressed and lighter industries began mass producing items like clothing and food, which would have been the items that women in the home, right, were responsible for either creating or obtaining from their farmland, it became vitally important that there be households, meaning housewives, to buy them. So if they were no longer creating the garments, then it became important for them to be able to buy what they had once been creating. But as working for a salary became standard practice, the reality that housewives contributed to the economy became harder to see. The idea arose that work was what someone else paid you money to do. Not work was what you were not paid to do. Work was what men did out in public. Not work was what women did at home. So when they began to redefine what women were doing in the home as not labor, there began to be some problems. According to this theory, women had no desire to be compensated. They did all they did out of instinct. We give our time and energy to others as automatically as a cow grazes or the grass grows. Our caring is a natural resource. It follows from this worldview that female labor did not count. So this kind of worldview that went from what women did in the home and childbearing being a form of labor and being important to, oh, what women do is not as important. It really doesn't count. All right. Of course, women should do their work for free. Many women even came to believe that it was simply in their natures to do anything for love. So there was a specific shift in the way that people thought about women, in the way that they thought about how women contributed to society. They began to think less of it as equal labor and something of importance to she's working for free. She's only doing it for love. She doesn't really need to be compensated. It doesn't need to be seen as a form of labor. And here we are today with that same mindset. All right. So when we come back next week, we're going to talk more about this concept of tricks and how that relates to the trick industry today. You'll learn about the trick industry next week. All right, back to, for our last segment here, Kingdom Marriage by Tony Evans. And we're going to complete our piece here where he's talking about the resolve that as a married couple you must have to respond to the thorns in your marriage. A response, your response to the thorn. As we saw earlier, the Apostle Paul responded to his thorn first in prayer. He implored the Lord to get rid of it in 2 Corinthians 12:8. Following Paul's example, we should also pray first about the thorns we are experiencing in our marriages. For your marriage to reach its greatest potential in both fulfillment and purpose, it needs to be bathed regularly in prayer. Rather than complaining about the thorn that irritates you, take it to the Lord and ask if he will remove it. He might do just that. And if the answer is no, and the Lord has not removed the thorn after multiple requests, then seek God's wisdom about what he wants you to learn in the midst of it. And seek God's strength to bear it well, just as God told Paul to do. God did not remove his thorn, but he gave Paul a bit of insight. My grace, he said, is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. My translation reads like this: I'm not going to grant your request, Paul, but I will meet your need. In the meantime, while God was meeting Paul's need for grace to handle the thorn he had been dealt, God was also perfecting Paul's power to live the abundant life. He was developing Paul for a purpose yet to come. God doesn't always answer yes. If he did, his sovereignty would not be possible, and we would be in a world of hurt. When you look back over your life and the things that you have asked for in prayer, how many no's are you now grateful for? I'm grateful for a lot of them. I'm grateful that God said, no, not them, and not now. Okay? They say that hindsight is 20/20, but God always sees with perfect vision, past, present, and future. While God may not remove the thorn by answering yes to your prayers, I can assure you that if you are enduring a thorn that he refuses to get rid of, he will also supply sufficient grace for you to handle it. This is a promise based on God's word, found in what I consider to be the greatest verse on grace in the entire Bible. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8. Write that down for you, for those of you taking notes. All right. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8, the pool of God's grace is available to you when you need it. It says this: God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. You need to access this pool of grace by relying on his strength and focusing on his will in the midst of your pain and trials. When you are dealing with a thorn in your relationship with your spouse and you have committed it to prayer and yet God has not removed it, ask God for his grace. Don't try to pull the thorn out yourself because you are going to rip something. Rather, go searching for God's grace. The difference between a defeated marriage and a victorious marriage with the same thorn is that the victorious couple is experiencing grace while the other couple is trying to fix things on their own. One marriage is resting under the spiritual cover of grace, while the other marriage may be battling things out only in the physical realm. There are always two ways of dealing with any problem in your marriage. One way is to get rid of the problem. There's nothing wrong with that. If the problem can be solved effectively, then do it. But the other way is to have something happen in your marriage at such a superior level that it causes you to forget the problem or no longer view it as a problem, but rather to view it through the lens of learning. For example, let's say you suffer from depression, but when you go out to the mailbox today or tomorrow, you pull out a legitimate check for $1 million. Do you think you're going to feel depressed that day? It's doubtful, simply because something so devastatingly glorious has trumped the thorn, making it seem less significant. Married couple, we serve a God who can do exceedingly abundantly above the devastatingly glorious in your home and in your marriage. If you will pull off your gloves and stop viewing each other as the thorn itself and seek his purpose in it. When you spend your life running from your thorns, you miss the revelation and illumination and the grace that God wants to give you. We've all been to the doctor, and at some point we've all been stuck by that needle that pricks. The needle irritates us and even causes many of us to hate needles and maybe even doctors. But inside the prick of the needle is medicine that's designed for your benefit, or blood that is designed for your good. The same thing hurting you is also helping you. Yet, if you tell the nurse, "Don't stick me because that needle hurts," you might be rid of the immediate pain, but you are also rid of the medication and what you have to gain from it, which would be better health. If God is sticking your marriage and your relationship somehow right now, if there is something that's truly irritating you, then pray and ask God to fix it or remove it. If he doesn't, you need to accept that he has medicine in the thorn that will bring you and your marriage into better health. The Apostle Paul learned this lesson about his thorn. We know this by his response. If you make his response your own in marriage, you will be amazed at how strong God makes you. You will be able to handle things that used to cause you to lose your temper. The things you used to say that were disrespectful won't escape your lips. Bitterness, anger, or suspicion that you used to harbor regularly will be replaced with peace and trust. Here's what Paul said. And this is 2 Corinthians 12. Second Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. All right. The whole chapter is good, but this is the crux of what Paul learns from God. He says, "Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distress, with persecution, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." All right. Let me put a caveat in here. This is not saying, Paul is saying take beatings or take abuse. Okay. Let me just put that out there, because I know somebody will take this and run with it. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about things that happen in your marriage, right? There can be irritations. That can be disagreements. All right? That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about taking beatings from your spouse. So I just want to clarify that. Paul not only accepted his thorn, he actually praised God for his weaknesses because in his weaknesses, he discovered his true strength. Complaining or whining, okay, is not bragging about your thorn. Bragging involves approaching God's throne to praise him for supplying the grace you need to grow in it. It is learning the secret power of contentment and gratitude, knowing that God has allowed the thorn for your good and the good of your relationship. Oysters and clams get irritated regularly. Whenever sand gets inside their shells, it becomes an irritant. The problem is that the oyster, like Paul, cannot get rid of what is pricking it. But what the oyster does instead is secrete a liquid onto the sand. And as the oyster continues to secrete this liquid around the irritant, that grain of sand gets transformed into a pearl. It becomes something valuable and expensive because it was allowed to remain for its intended purpose. God's grace is what you need to transform the thorns in your marriage into pearls of great value. When his grace covers that thorn, it will become a blessing at some level if you stop fighting it and yield to it by seeking his wisdom and his strength. His grace is sufficient. So, in conclusion, when dealing with thorns, you have to look at it this way. If there's something happening in my marital relationship that is annoying to me, and I have prayed and I have said, God, please remove it or change me. Remove it or change my perspective. I'm going to tell you, in my own life, when I was going through my dating, my courtship process, really more so, because my husband and I, we never dated. We didn't date. We actually got engaged because the Lord told us to get engaged. And then we spent 2 years and 10 months learning each other. And not in an intimate way, by the way, but just learning each other. And in that process, I did a lot of praying. I did a lot of going to God and saying, hey, this is what I see. I know this is the person that you have for me, but this is what I see. How do I deal with it? Show me how to deal with it. Do I pray for this to be gone? Or is this something that I need to work through within myself? That's an irritation that's not necessarily wrong, but it's maybe something that irritates me. Or there would be certain things that we would talk out and have long conversations about. We had conversations about ministry. We had conversations about our roles in the relationship. We had conversations about our future and what that looked like. Some things, before you get married, if you are on here and you have the opportunity to have those conversations, you need to have them. If you're seeing stuff now that irritates you, you need to have the conversation about what irritates you, and don't just automatically think it'll go away if I don't say anything, because that's not good. All right. If you're in the marriage and there are things that are irritating you, I don't think there's any time I've gone to the Lord about something that my husband has done that either my husband hasn't changed or God hasn't spoken to him directly. All right. After I prayed about it, that God hasn't spoken to him directly about it, or maybe something that my husband saw in me, and then maybe a couple weeks later, a couple days later, my husband actually did the same thing that he saw in me so that he could see it in himself. And those are always fun times. All right. So I really believe in the power of prayer to help us to understand how to better operate in our relationships and how to better operate with our spouse. All right. And I believe that if we take things to the Lord first, we don't have to get on social media and blast our spouse. Let me sip my hot pineapple juice. If you want to kill a relationship, get on social media and blast your spouse. If you want to kill a relationship, get on social media and start talking about what your spouse doesn't do right. Because now, number one, that's a permanent record online. Even if you delete the comment, it's still out in cyberspace. Number two, you now invited people to give their unwarranted opinions on your spouse that your spouse may come across and read. And so it just creates, it metastasizes, let me put it that way. It takes maybe something that might have been a small issue, and it now invites other people into that small issue, and then it becomes larger than it was. So I never advise people to talk about their spouse in a negative way online. Talk to a counselor. First of all, talk to the Lord. Talk to a counselor if need be. Talk to a covenant trusted friend who has proven that they can keep confidences. All right. Talk to your spiritual leader, who again is a spiritual leader that actually keeps confidences, because not all spiritual leaders know how to keep their mouths closed, unfortunately. But social media does not need to become the place where you vent about your marital issues. All right. Some people will say, well, I'm just keeping it real, and I'm just being transparent. No, what you're actually doing is you're violating the privacy of your covenant. I think I want to say that again. You're not keeping it real. You're not keeping it transparent, because marriage is between you, your spouse, and the Lord. You, your spouse, and the Lord. All right? So that's where the communication needs to start first. It doesn't need to start on social media. So when people say, I'm just keeping it real, I'm just keeping it transparent, no, you're violating the privacy of your covenant. You are. You're violating the privacy of your covenant. And then what happens is your spouse may see that violation of the privacy of your covenant and feel like they have lost some of that ability to communicate with you in the covenant as someone that they can trust, as someone that they can lay themselves bare and open with. All right? Think Genesis, naked and not ashamed. So when I think about that, if me and my spouse are supposed to be naked with each other and not ashamed, that's supposed to happen between me and my spouse. I'm not supposed to be laying my spouse bare and shaming my spouse for the world to see. All right? And unfortunately, some people don't get that lesson in marriage counseling. So I'm going to give it to you now. You're not supposed to be laying your spouse bare for the world to see. You're not supposed to be shaming your spouse. You're not supposed to be exposing your spouse's weaknesses for the world to see. Why? Because it's none of their business. And again, I'm not talking about abuse. I'm talking about your spouse's simple human shortcomings. Everybody doesn't need to know what they are. You do. As the spouse. Why? Because you're the one supposed to be praying for them and covering them, asking God to bless them, asking God to strengthen them, asking God to empower them, asking God to grace them for them to be a better human being. All right. So that's all I have to say for today. This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues. When we come back next week, we're going to be talking about chapter 8, which is requests. Requests. All right. And then we're going to get back into talking about dating and the tricks and how dating was initially seen as something that women of the night did. All right. And of course, we later began to see how it became something that women were doing to supplement their income because of income inequality. Origins of dating. So ladies, you got to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. All right. I hope you got some insight today. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. I want to thank you again for your time and attention. Take care and God bless. Thank you again, and you have a great one as well.